was the night before Christmas and I, Ethan, was on my way to visit my family. The snow fell heavily on the roads and covered everything in a thick white blanket. Christmas meant everything to me because it was a time for family, tradition, and warmth. But this trip, something felt off. I had been driving for hours, and the roads were getting quieter and emptier. The only sound was the hiss of my tires on the snowy asphalt. I noticed a car behind me and followed too closely for comfort. At first, I thought it was just another traveler, but it kept tailing me for miles, even as I turned onto smaller and more isolated roads. Then, my heart started to race. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but there was something unsettling about how the car didn't seem to change speed or direction. Then, suddenly, my tire went flat. I pulled over to the side of the road and my breath was visible in the cold air. The car that had been following me was now nowhere to be seen. I looked around, but all I saw was a vast and empty stretch of road. No lights and no houses. Just snow was stretching endlessly in every direction. Then I got out of the car, shivering, and tried to change the tire. But my hands were frozen because the cold seemed to be seeping into my bones. Just then, I heard it. The sound of something moving behind me. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Suddenly the storm hit and the wind howled like a wild animal, and the snow began to fall faster and harder. I got back in my car and tried to drive, but the road was becoming impossible to follow because the headlights barely cut through the blizzard. I had no choice but to leave the main road, heading down a narrow and unmarked path. It felt like the storm was pushing me there, as if it wanted me to go that way. Then, I was being led somewhere, but I had no idea where or why. The snow was now so thick that I could barely see in front of me. My car struggled to move through the deep snow, but then I saw something. A cabin. It was small, old, and seemed to appear out of nowhere in the white haze. I was exhausted, cold, and relieved. Then I pulled up and ran to the door, desperate to find shelter from the storm. The door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the warmth hit me like a wave. There was a fireplace, even though it wasn't lit. The place looked abandoned, dust covered the furniture, and the windows were boarded up, blocking any light from outside. The silence was deafening, broken only by the howling wind. Then, I explored the cabin and hoped to find something to make the night more bearable. Then I saw them. Old newspaper clippings, yellowed with age, pinned to the wall. They told a story of a family that had vanished from this cabin decades ago, without a trace. Suddenly, my heart skipped a beat because the more I read, the more it felt like this place had been frozen in time. Later, I sat down by the fire and tried to shake the unease creeping up my spine. But then, I noticed something strange. In a small and hidden compartment under the floorboards, I found a child's toy, a worn teddy bear, and beside it a faded photograph of a family. They looked happy, but the faces were blurry. I couldn't stop staring at the image and felt a strange chill run down my back because I thought I was safe. But now I wasn't so sure. The wind howled louder as I sat there in the cabin and tried to make sense of everything. The fire crackled, but the warmth felt distant. It wasn't long before the strange noises began. At first, it was just the wind and shook the old wooden walls, but then I heard something else. Footsteps, soft and slow, almost too quiet to hear. Then I froze. Now I felt like the lights flickered, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch and twist. I wasn't sure if it was my mind playing tricks or something else, but the cabin suddenly felt much too small, much too alive. I looked outside the window and hoped to see something, but then I saw it. A footprint, just outside the cabin. Only one and fresh. It was impossible because the storm had covered everything, and there was no way anyone could have been out there. My heart raced as I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but the smell, a faint and unfamiliar perfume, seemed to linger in the air. I felt like someone was watching me. I could feel their presence, even though I couldn't see them. I turned to leave the room, but then I saw it. The bathroom mirror had something written on it, words that I couldn't understand at first. But as the steam from my breath cleared, I saw it clearly. "You can't escape." Then I backed away from the mirror as my hands were shaking. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me, and I knew then I wasn't alone. I couldn't stop thinking about the photograph, the teddy bear, and many strange incidents because something about them made me feel like the past was still alive in this cabin. So, I started searching for more answers. I looked through every old newspaper clipping I could find, and the more I read, the worse it became because the family that had lived here, Mom, Dad, and a little boy who had vanished. The clippings said the parents were found brutally murdered in the cabin, but the little boy, he was never found. I felt a chill in my bones as I read the details. The parents had been killed in their sleep, with no sign of a struggle. The police said there were strange marks around the bodies, but no one knew what they meant. The little boy had disappeared without a trace, and some people believed he had been taken by whatever had done the murders. As I read, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Suddenly, I heard a loud bang from upstairs. My heart skipped. I froze for a moment, and then my curiosity pushed me to go up. The stairs creaked beneath my feet, each step louder than the last. The room at the top was dark, but I could see something shining faintly in the corner. Then, I slowly walked towards it and found a hidden door. My hands shook as I opened it, and then I saw inside was a small room, filled with strange things. Old dolls with missing eyes, dusty masks, and what looked like old toys. Suddenly the air was thick and heavy with the past. It felt like I wasn't alone. Then I saw it. A doll that looked just like the little boy in the photograph, but with no eyes. My heart raced. What had happened to this family? And why did I feel like I was being pulled into the same nightmare? The storm still raged outside when I saw her. Mrs. Gable was an elderly woman who lived nearby. I spotted her walking through the snow, and her hunched back barely visible in the white storm. At first I was relieved because someone was there. Maybe she knew something about the cabin, the family, and anything. Then, I opened the door to invite her in, and she shuffled inside with a strange and unsettling smile. Her eyes darted around the room and never met mine. "Oh, you are staying here?" she asked, and her voice was raspy. "You should leave, you know. This place isn't for people like you." I didn't know what to say. "Why?" I asked. "What happened here?" Her smile faltered for a moment. Nothing happened here. It is just a cabin. Old, quiet, and peaceful," she said quickly, but I could tell she wasn't telling the truth. Then she started talking about the family, but her words didn't make sense. "They were happy," she muttered, "but they disappeared and strange things happened. People vanish and sometimes they come back." But I felt uneasy because her stories didn't match the newspaper clippings I had read. They were full of contradictions. One moment she spoke like she knew everything about the family, and the next, she claimed she had never heard of them. "Why are you so nervous?" I asked. But before she could answer, she suddenly stood up, muttered something about needing to leave, and shuffled out into the storm without another word. I stared after her and was confused because there was something off about Mrs. Gable, something dangerous. And now, I was alone again, more afraid than ever. The next morning, I woke up to an eerie silence. The storm was still heavy outside, but the power had gone out. I checked my phone. Dead. No signal. No way to contact the outside world. I tried to light the fire again, but the wood wouldn't catch. Now the cabin felt colder and darker, like something was smothering it. I could hear footsteps outside, but when I looked, no one was there because the snow had covered everything, leaving no tracks. Suddenly, I smelled something burning. Then I rushed to the kitchen as my heart was pounding because the stove was off, but the smell of smoke was thick in the air. I turned to the hallway, but the temperature was dropping fast and the chill in the air was suffocating. Then I heard it. A low and grinding sound, like something scraping against the walls. I turned around, but nothing was there. I felt the hairs on my neck stand up, and that feeling, the one that told me I was being watched, returned. As I walked towards the living room, I saw something in the corner of my eye. A shadow was moving in the dim light. My heart raced, but when I turned to look, it was gone. Suddenly, I stood frozen and stared at the wall in front of me. My breath fogged up the air because something caught my eye. Written in red, scrawled across the wall, "You are next." I backed away slowly as my hands were shaking. Now the fear in my chest turned to panic. Who was doing this? Why was this happening to me? I didn't know what to believe anymore. All I knew was that the nightmare was getting closer. Now I couldn't stay in that cabin anymore because the walls felt like they were closing in on me. I had to get out and I had to find help. But the storm was fierce outside. The snow was falling so heavily that I could barely see my own hand in front of my face. Then I went to my car and started the engine. But the engine stopped working and couldn't drive. Later, I stepped out into the blizzard and felt the cold bite at my skin. The wind howled around me, and the snow swirled like a white fog, blurring everything in sight. I couldn't tell which way to go. I just ran and hoped to find a road or a sign, anything that could lead me to safety. But the storm was relentless and each step I took felt heavier. The snow was piling up fast, and I felt like I was sinking deeper into the storm. My heart raced as I turned and tried to make sense of the world around me because every direction looked the same. Snow, ice, and more snow. Then I heard it, the sound of footsteps in the snow. Soft at first, but they grew louder and closer. I stopped dead in my tracks because the stalker was out there, I was sure of it. But I couldn't see him. Only the sound of his footsteps followed mine. My breath came in short gasps as I stumbled and my legs were growing weak. The snow was blinding and I was lost. I had to find shelter, but there was nothing around. Just snow and more snow. And then, through the storm, I saw something. An opening in the distance. I staggered toward it and my hope was rising because it was an old mine shaft. It could be the refuge I needed, or it could be a death trap. I stood there for a moment and I was torn between the unknown and the terror I knew was closing in. And then I moved toward the mine shaft. The mine shaft was cold and dark inside. I couldn't see much, but I heard the crunch of footsteps behind me. They were so close now and my heart pounded in my chest as I looked around, searching for a way out. Suddenly, a figure stepped into the shadows and I froze because of the stalker. I could see his dark silhouette against the pale light outside. My breath caught in my throat. "Why are you doing this?" I shouted, and my voice was trembling. "What do you want from me?" The stalker didn't answer. Instead, he took a step closer and his face was hidden, but his body language screamed danger. I backed away and tried to put distance between us, but my foot slipped on the ice and I fell hard to the ground. Before I could react, the stalker lunged. His hands gripped my throat and squeezed tight. I struggled and gasped for air, but his strength was too much and then my vision started to blur. "Revenge," he finally whispered and his voice was cold. "For the family you ruined, for the tragedy you caused." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The past, the murders, the missing child. It all came flooding back in a rush. This was about revenge for the family that had died here. With a final burst of strength, I pushed him away and scrambled to my feet. But it was too late. The stalker grabbed me again, this time pulling me back toward the darkness. My heart raced as I tried to fight back, but I was too weak. Then he dragged me to the cabin. When we reached the cabin, the last thing I saw was the stalker's cold eyes before everything went black. Detective Harris wasn't sure what had happened to Ethan, but something told him the cabin wasn't just a random place for someone to disappear. He had heard rumors about the old cabin for years. People said it was cursed. Others claimed it was haunted by the ghosts of the family that had vanished so long ago. Then he arrived at the cabin and his breath was visible in the cold air. The snow had finally stopped, but everything around him was still covered in white, and the cabin was too silent. Inside, Harris found signs of a struggle. Furniture was overturned and there were footprints in the dust. It looked like Ethan had tried to escape, just like the others who had come before him. But what had happened to him? Harris went through the cabin carefully, piece by piece, and looking for any clue that could explain the strange disappearances. He found the same newspaper clippings that Ethan had read, the stories of the murdered parents and the missing child. But there was something new, something that made Harris stop in his tracks. One of the clippings had a photograph of the missing family, and in the background of that photo, just behind the little boy, was a shadowy figure. Harris felt a chill run down his spine because he couldn't believe it. The figure in the photo, was that the stalker? Then something caught his eye. A hidden drawer in the old desk. Inside was a small and faded photograph of the missing child, and behind it, another photograph, one of the stalkers, a younger man standing with the family. The connection was clear now. The stalker wasn't just some random person. He was the missing child, grown up, and seeking revenge for the murders of his parents. The detective looked at the photograph in horror because the story was just beginning to unfold. I was trapped. My body was sore and my mind raced as I tried to think. The cabin felt like it was closing in on me. I could hear the wind howling outside, but it sounded like something more. Something alive. I knew the stalker was out there and waiting for the right moment to finish what he had started. I had to survive. But how? I was injured, and the snowstorm outside was getting worse. There was no way to escape on foot. The only chance I had was to outsmart him, to use whatever I could find in this cabin to fight back. Then, my eyes scanned the room, and I saw there was a fireplace with a few logs and some old tools scattered around. I had to act fast because the stalker would be back soon. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me, a slow creak of the floorboards. Then I turned around and my heart was racing because the stalker was close. He had found me. I grabbed a log from the fireplace and held it in front of me like a weapon. My breath came in short and I panicked gasps. I couldn't let him take me. For a moment, everything was silent. I waited, and barely breathing. Then, a figure stepped into the doorway. I swung the log with everything I had, but it missed. Then, the stalker lunged, and the struggle began. I fought back and my heart was pounding in my chest. But in the end, I managed to break free. I ran out into the storm and into the unknown. I escaped the cabin. But did I really escape? The stalker was still out there, and he wasn't finished with me. The fear lingered, even as I ran. Would he find me again? Was I ever truly safe? The blizzard swirled around me, and I felt the darkness closing in. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Please share this video with your friends and family too. Thanks.